All right, CNT120, we're working on Chapter 1, our Introduction to Networking. Here's the objectives of the chapter. We're going to break our chapter in a couple pieces here. This first podcast is just going to be kind of some introduction material on networks before we dig into a lot of the terms and the ideas that they're presenting us. So, we first start off the chapter. They give us a definition of a network. I added a couple pieces to it just to kind of help make a little more sense to you. Network is a group of computers and other devices, things like printers, smartphones, tablets, Xboxes, Wii's, PlayStations, all those things that are connected together by some type of transmission media. It could be copper wire, could be fiber optic, could be radio frequency. And we do that for a couple purposes. Well, let's kind of get our brain in gear about a network. All of us pretty much have a network in our house and almost any place we go, but it was not always like that. If we went back to the late 80s, early 90s, most people had no idea what a network was. So kind of how did we get where we are? So super quickly, if we go back in time to companies, okay? Companies would have a mainframe computer. Now we're talking the 60s and 70s here, if you will. They would have one large computer, and that's what you think of it as, basically one large computer, and everybody's terminal and keyboard were connected to it. So everybody in the company shared this large computer. Now that large computer, the original ones were the size of, a living room in a house, but eventually they'd be the size of like a big cabinet or a big fridge, if you will. Everybody connected to this mainframe, so all the files and everything were stored on there, and we all shared that big computer. Well, eventually time moved on, and they invented the personal computer, the PC. So now we're talking late 70s, early 80s, if you will. So now with the invention of the personal computer, we now have computers scattered all over the company, but we have no way to share information. So what was invented was the sneaker net. In this case, you'd put information on a floppy disk and literally carry it from computer to computer. Or if I wanted to print, I'd put it on a floppy disk here, walk it across the room, plug it in this computer, and print it because that computer was attached to a printer. So companies very quickly were like, hey, we need a way that we can move data around like we used to be able to do. So we needed a network. So that's why I put a little cloud there. The companies say we need a network. Well, what happens in kind of the late 70s, early 80s, even into the 80s, these companies now say, all right, we need a network, but everything was very proprietary. So Apple computers built an Apple network using Apple protocols, using Apple devices, using Apple cabling to share their files around the network and or send a file to the printer. Meanwhile, IBM is doing the same thing. With the IBM computers, they develop IBM devices using IBM cabling to move their data around the network and print things to a printer and share files and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, Xerox is doing the same thing. Xerox computers using Xerox devices, using Xerox network cards, using Xerox cabling, developed a network that they can, again, move files around and send things to printers and that sort of thing. Well, out of this evolved, again, everything's very proprietary. Everybody's company is doing their own thing for their own computers, for their own network. Well, eventually, as we move into the 80s, into the 90s, 90s, and the 2000s, out of all of these shakes out Ethernet. Ethernet was the network developed by Xerox. And Ethernet kind of won the long-term battle because it was a combination of, hey, it worked pretty good, hey, it was pretty cheap, it kind of got the job done. So therefore, most companies started evolving to it because it was kind of that middle of the road of like, hey, it works good enough, it's pretty cheap, it's pretty easy to connect up, it gets the job done. So just about everybody kind of migrates to the Ethernet network. So now if we start looking at networks today, they look something like this. Almost everything in our company attaches to the Ethernet network, including phones and security cameras and laptops and smartphones and everything. And the main reason we do this in a company is so we can share files, we can share printers, and more importantly, we can share this ISP connection, the connection to the internet. We can all share that. Okay, that's how kind of companies evolved over time. Well, how about our house? Because again, our houses, even my church has a network. So how did we get there? We see the companies kind of evolved so that they could share the files and share the printers and share the internet connection. What happened at home? Okay. If you go back into the early 90s at home, a lot of us now start getting personal computers. You know, it might be the gateway computer and the big cow box and things like that. And what we did at that time is we used a dial-up modem. And the dial-up modem allowed us to get to the internet via a phone line. So our computer connects to a dial-up modem. The modem converts all of our digital information on the computer to an analog signal to go across the phone line to the phone company. That's how a lot of us got started with connecting to the internet. So there, the main reason is literally getting us to a to the internet, or internet connection, if you will. Well, a lot of us would have, I actually zoomed ahead on that slide there, apologize. A lot of us had a modem and a phone sharing a phone splitter, so it was one of those deals of I could use the computer or the phone. I couldn't use both. So some of us evolved and actually bought a second phone line. We had a dedicated phone line for the modem and computer, and a dedicated phone line for the phone. So we had literally two connections there. I made do with one because I was cheap and didn't want to buy two connections, but a lot of people did this. Then comes along things like DSL and cable modems. Now we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, we start getting the DSL cable modem thing. So a lot of people moved their computer connection to DSL or cable modem to get connection to the internet, and they left their phone line connected to the phone company. So again, we now have two different connections for two different purposes. Well, along comes the days, maybe early 2000s for some people, they get a second computer in the house. Initially, it was an issue of, okay, what do we do now? Because the DSL or cable modem was designed for one device, one computer. So along comes this second computer, whatever it was. Maybe you bought a new one and you kept the old one, kind of thing. Now we're like, well, now what do we do? Well, this is when a friend or a neighbor says, well, go buy this router thing. So you go to the store, and it might have been Staples or Office Max or, Circuit City, something like that. Yeah, I know, I said Circuit City. They went and bought a Linksys or Netgear DSL or cable router that allowed these two computers to connect to the DSL or cable modem. And again, you still probably have the phone line over here. Some of us still had the phone line early 2000s. Cell phone and cell phone coverage was not good enough yet for a lot of people. Well, then eventually, our cell phone coverage gets good enough that our house line phone goes away. This is probably the case for a lot of you. And now we have just this one connection. DSL or cable modem, might be Fios now, okay, something along those lines, into my router at home, and everything in my house connects to this router. Linksys, Netgear, Belkin router that you have. My laptops, my desktops, my printers, my Wiis, my Xbox, my PlayStations, and any other portable devices you have. Some of you might even have a little server there, media server, file server kind of thing, that connects into your network. Well, what's really going on is, if I were to take this little Netgear router and break it open, don't do that, but if I were to take and break it open, what I would actually find is circuitry in there that has roughly 3 pieces of equipment in. The first piece of equipment is a router firewall that connects to the DSL, cable modem, Fios box, whatever it is, and that is there to make the connection between their network and your network, as well as add some security. It then connects to a switch inside. These are the little ports on the back of this device, the little switch ports. So there's a little switch in here. These little ports on the back are there for the devices to physically plug into. It then connects into an access point, which most of us knew this a handful of years ago because there was actually antennas on the outside of our little router device, okay, these little antennas here. Most newer ones do not have those antennas on. They're actually kind of wrapped around the inside of the case, so they're not visible anymore. But there's an access point in there because you can connect to it wirelessly, laptop, smartphone, tablet, whatever. So that little Linksys, Netgear, Belkin router that you have is really a network in a box, for lack of a better term. It is actually a full network in a box. So why have we evolved to this? Well, if you think back, when we started adding the second computer, we needed something that would allow the second computer to connect to get to the internet. So we add this device here, which again is really a network in a box, so that all of these things can get to the internet, share the internet connection, and all of these things here can do things like share this printer or share this file server that you have at home. That's exactly the same reason that companies have evolved into putting in networks. We have done the exact same thing. We were just maybe 10 years, 20 years behind them, depending on where you live and your house and so forth. We were, 10 years behind them doing the exact same thing on a smaller scale. That's why we have networks. That's how we have evolved, that we have this little doodad that everything in my house connects to. Okay? So there is kind of our super quick background on networks. The book kind of assumes you know this, but I like to remind everybody this before we start down this road of all these new terms and technologies and everything. This is super quickly how we got where we are in companies and in home. On the next podcast, I will continue with the next concepts from the chapter.